Is it possible for the workshop of the world to lose its shine? Welcome to CSS Breakdown, book by book, season 06, episode 15, as we delve into Norman Lowe's Mastering Modern British History, 4th edition. Today, we're taking a deep dive into Britain's economic transformation, starting right at its peak as the global industrial powerhouse in the mid-19th century. And then we'll explore the significant shifts and, well, the challenges it navigated in the late 19th century, looking at both industry and agriculture.
That's right. And our mission here is really to get beyond simple narratives of decline. We want to, dissect this concept of adaptation. Was Britain losing its way, or was it actually evolving, maybe quite skillfully, in the face of new global realities? We'll pull apart different historical interpretations and, crucially, try to understand what these big economic forces meant for the everyday lives of people across Britain. It's about extracting those surprising facts and key insights that give us a much more complete picture.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to really grasp any perceived decline, we first have to appreciate the sheer dominance of Britain's golden age. And, well, what better symbol of that than the Great Exhibition of 1851? This wasn't just some trade show. It was a massive statement to the world. Imagine stepping into the Crystal Palace, this absolutely vast, awe-inspiring structure of glass and cast iron. Designed by Joseph Paxton, right?
Yeah, Paxton.
Oh.
And it stretched almost a third of a mile long in Hyde Park. Huge. Prince Albert himself was, the real driving force behind it. It really was an architectural marvel. And what was inside was maybe even more profound. You had British exhibits showcasing every conceivable type of machinery, and much of it was actually working railway engines, steam plows, massive steamship engines, industrial hammers, printing machines.
Wow.
And the manufacturers, Lancashire cottons, Nottingham lace. But here's where it gets really interesting, almost quirky. They even showed off a silent piano made entirely of papier-mâché.
A silent piano made of paper.
Papier-mâché, yeah. And, maybe even more surprisingly, an unsinkable deck chair. It just highlights the kind of boundless ingenuity of the era,
A silent piano and an unsinkable deck chair. That's fantastic. It gives such a glimpse into that inventive spirit. And it wasn't just about Britain showing off its own stuff, was it? They included foreign exhibits, too.
Exactly. Things like Dresden china, French silks. That was important because it underscored Britain's commitment to free trade, even as it showed off its own dominance.
Right, making a point.
And the impact was enormous. Over 6 million visitors poured through the Crystal Palace in just 5 months, many from overseas. This led directly to a flood of new export orders. It absolutely cemented Britain's reputation as the workshop of the world, a moment of real national pride.
And the numbers that followed this period, they're just staggering, aren't they?
Yeah.
How can we sort of visualize the scale of this export boom, say, from 1850 to 1875?
Oh, the figures paint a picture of, well, explosive growth. Take iron and steel exports, they increased more than sixfold. From around 450,000 tons a year to nearly 3 million tons.
Oh, credible.
Coal exports quintupled. Cotton textiles, a huge industry, went from under 1 billion yards exported annually to over 3.5 billion yards.
Just phenomenal numbers.
Woolen goods tripled. And the total value of exports, it nearly doubled in this period, from about 124 million in the 1840s average to over 218 million by the 1870s average. It fundamentally reshaped global trade.
Wow. Okay, so massive growth. But what did all that actually mean for the average person, living and working in Britain then?
That's the crucial bit, isn't it? It meant a real, tangible improvement in daily life for many. Wages for industrial workers went up by about 50% between 1850 and 1875.
50%? That's huge.
It is. Now, prices rose too, but only by about 20%. So real wages, what people could actually afford to buy, went up by a substantial 30%.
30% better off in real terms.
Exactly. That's a powerful insight into how these economic booms can translate sometimes into living standards.
So what was the real secret sauce then? What were the key ingredients behind this rapid growth and sustained prosperity?
Well, there were several fundamental factors working together. First, and maybe biggest, Britain enjoyed the massive advantage of being the first industrial nation. For a while, there was basically no serious competition. Future rivals like the USA, they were preoccupied with their civil war in the 1860s. And Germany wasn't even unified until 1871. In fact, both of them were actually significant buyers of British goods at this time.
So a massive head start. But I imagine that alone wouldn't be enough without keeping the innovation going.
Absolutely not. Crucial advancements kept Britain ahead, especially in metals. You had Henry Bessemer's converter system in 1856. That allowed for mass production of steel much more cheaply. It meant steel rails for railways, steel plating for ships, replacing iron. A big step. Then, William Siemens developed his open hearth process in 1867, which produced an even stronger type of steel. These weren't just small tweaks, they were game changers driving the next phase.
And Britain's population was growing rapidly then, too. How did that feed into this industrial engine?
Massively. A larger population meant a huge and growing domestic demand for manufactured goods. More people needing clothes, tools, household items. The population went from about 27 million in 1851 to over 31 million by 1871. This expanding home market provided a really robust foundation, feeding directly back into industrial growth.
Right, a built-in market. And the government played a role, too, didn't it? Particularly with this idea of free trade.
A pivotal role. William Gladstone, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 50s and 60s, was key. He removed almost all the remaining tariffs, the import duties. This bold, sort of hands-off, laissez-faire approach meant very few artificial restrictions on trade. Britain could get cheap raw materials from its empire.
Like cotton.
Exactly. And then flood the global market with relatively inexpensive manufactured goods. It was a powerful kind of symbiotic relationship.
Of course, all that trade needs moving around. So shipping, shipbuilding, railways, they must have been absolutely booming.
They were the essential logistical backbone. Huge expansion in ports like Glasgow, Newcastle, Liverpool, London. New docks were being built constantly just to handle the volume.
Right.
And on land, the railway mania was just this massive economic driver in itself. Think about it. Less than 2,000 miles of track in 1843. Another 5,000 miles laid by 1850, and over 14,500 miles by 1875.
That's incredible expansion.
It created thousands of jobs, directly and indirectly, a huge market for iron, then steel and coal. It boosted railway towns like Crewe and Swindon, and crucially, it meant rapid, cheap transport of manufactured goods to the ports, which was absolutely vital for increasing those exports we talked about.
And all this growth, all this building needs capital, money to invest. Britain seemed to have that in spades.
Absolutely abundant capital. The 1844 Bank Charter Act had helped make banking and credit more reliable. And the immense profits from industries like cotton textiles just provided this continuous flow of cash for further expansion.
A virtuous cycle.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that by 1875, Britons had invested something like 12 billion pounds abroad. Huge sums. And often that money was used by foreigners to buy British goods, so it fueled itself. Plus, you had gold discoveries in California, Australia, New Zealand.
Right, adding more fuel to the fire.
Yeah, increasing capital, boosting global demand for British manufacturers. It all clicked together.
It really sounds like an almost unbroken golden streak. But even for this period, I think some historians offer a bit of a caveat, a slight reality check.
That's a good point to raise. Yes, while it was undeniably a boom overall, some economic historians like F. Creuset point out that even between 1850 and 1873, there were several short, sharp periods of depression. The most serious seems to have been in 1858. During these dips, workers could definitely find themselves laid off or on short time, so it wasn't a completely smooth upward curve for everyone. It's important to remember that underlying vulnerability, even in the good times.
Right, a crucial nuance. Okay, so if that was the golden age, let's turn our attention to what happened next. The period after 1873, it's often been labeled an industrial depression. But was it really a Great Depression, or is that label maybe a bit of a historical myth?
This is where it gets really interesting because there's a major historical debate here. Contemporaries, people living through it, certainly often saw the last quarter of the 19th century in gloomy terms. They saw the economic rise of the USA and Germany and felt Britain was falling behind. It felt like a depression to many. However, historians looking back, especially since World War II, have seriously questioned how severe this Great Depression actually was. S.B. Saul, for instance, wrote a book back in 1985 provocatively titled The Myth of the Great Depression.
The myth. Okay, so what's the core argument against it being a really severe slump then?
Well, the fascinating thing is, unlike the truly catastrophic depression of the 1930s, there wasn't a sharp fall in total exports. In fact, production and export volume generally continued to rise in most industries through this period. Steel saw massive expansion, coal output went up, cotton output went up.
So production is still rising.
Right, albeit maybe the rate of growth was slowing down compared to that earlier explosive period. But it wasn't an absolute collapse in production across the board. The decrease in iron production, for example, was largely offset by the huge increase in steel.
Okay, so if production and export volumes were often still going up, why on earth would businesses and economists at the time call it a depression? What were they feeling?
The absolute key was falling prices. While the volume of stuff being exported often increased, the value, the cash they got for it, often decreased. Take cotton cloth again. Exports went up significantly in yardage between the 1870s and 1890s, but their actual cash value fell.
So selling more, but earning less for it.
Precisely. This led to declining profits and what economists call squeezed profit margins. For businesses used to the boom years, that felt like a depression, even if the factories were still busy.
And I guess squeezed profits would lead to trying to cut costs, maybe periodic unemployment.
It did. Employers definitely tried to cut costs, sometimes by laying off workers or reducing wages. This led to noticeable bursts of unemployment. The average unemployment rate for trade union members did creep up slightly, and some individual years were quite bad, maybe 11% in 1879, 10% in 1886.
That's pretty high.
It is, but it wasn't sustained high unemployment across the whole 25-year period. Those severe years, though, created real hardship and a lot of concern. Enough pressure, actually, that a royal commission was appointed in 1886 to investigate. And it concluded there was, and I quote, a diminution of profit with a corresponding diminution of employment for the laboring classes. So the concern was real.
So it's definitely a complex picture, not a simple decline, maybe more of a slowdown or a shift in conditions. What were the main factors historians point to as causing this perceived slowdown?
It seems to have been multifaceted, no single cause. One clear factor was that the huge boom in railway building, both at home and abroad, slowed down significantly after 1870. Less track being laid meant less demand for metals, for coal, for labor.
Okay, that makes sense.
But perhaps the most significant factor, and maybe an inevitable one, was the emergence of serious foreign competition. The USA, with its vast natural resources and growing immigrant labor force, and a unified, rapidly industrializing Germany, started challenging Britain's dominance.
Right, they were catching up fast.
Very fast. Britain's economic growth rate from 1873 to 1913 averaged about 1.3% per year, which sounds okay, but Germany was growing at nearly 4% and the USA at almost 5%.
Wow, big difference.
Yeah. It meant Britain's share of a growing global market was shrinking, even if its absolute output was still growing in many areas.
So ironically, it sounds like being the first to industrialize suddenly became a bit of a disadvantage.
In some ways, yes, that's a key argument. Britain's existing machinery and industrial plants were often older, sometimes even obsolete compared to what competitors were installing. Competitors could start fresh with the very latest technology. German steel producers, for instance, widely adopted the more efficient Siemens and Gilchrist-Thomas furnaces.
While Britain was stuck with older methods.
Well, heavily invested in the older, sometimes more expensive, Bessemer converters, this kind of legacy system problem cropped up elsewhere, too, in the American cotton industry, adopting ring spinning while Britain stuck with mule spinning longer. It meant Britain was sometimes slower to adapt, maybe less efficient, more expensive in production. And this started to bite, losing markets in Europe and America, partly due to foreign tariffs protecting their own industries and facing more imported goods competing at home.
And what about management? Were British business leaders just failing to adapt? Was there a sort of complacency?
That's another major area historians focus on. There seems to be broad agreement on serious management failures, though the exact reasons are debated. Earlier theories, like Eric Hobsbawm's or Martin Wiener's class and culture idea that the industrial middle class started acting like aristocrats, investing in land and leisure instead of industry, those are largely rejected now. But most historians do agree there were problems. The dominance of family firms, where top jobs often went to sons or nephews based on connection rather than merit, could lead to, well, deteriorated inspiration by the third or fourth generation.
Less drive, perhaps.
Perhaps, and maybe insufficient effort to develop new industries. Britain relied heavily on its traditional staples: coal, iron, textiles. Germany, meanwhile, was forging ahead in electrical engineering, in chemicals. There's also evidence of complacency in adopting new machinery, sometimes preferring to patch up old equipment rather than invest in the latest. And even when investing, sometimes making questionable decisions, like sticking to traditional looms in the cotton industry when automatic ones were available.
And not enough focus on science.
Too little attention paid to science and its industrial application, yes. That's often linked to the next point.
Which is the education system.
Exactly. Critics like Martin Wiener also pointed the finger at Britain's education system. They argued it just wasn't producing enough academically trained scientists and engineers. The famous public schools focus heavily on classics, not technology. Contrast that with Germany, which by 1872 had 11 purely technical universities, all state-funded and organized. That gave them a huge edge in those new science-based industries.
A significant difference in focus. And what about trade unions? Did they play a role?
Potentially, yes. Some argue that trade unions, trying to protect the jobs of their skilled members, sometimes resisted the introduction of new machines or processes that might de-skill labor or reduce the workforce. That could slow down adaptation.
Right. And then there's that big policy question. Britain's adherence to laissez-faire, to free trade. It served Britain well when it was dominant, but did it become a handicap later on?
It certainly became a major point of debate, and many contemporaries thought so. While Britain kept its markets open, other major industrial nations, Germany, France, Russia, the USA, started introducing protective import duties, tariffs, to shield their own growing industries.
Like the McKinley tariff in the U.S.
That's a famous example, yeah. The U.S. McKinley tariff of 1891 severely hit British woolen exports. So Britain faced protected markets abroad while its own home market was wide open to foreign competition. Free trade was great when you're the only major player, but much tougher when strong competitors emerge and they don't play by the same rules.
Okay, so we've got this collection of arguments pointing towards, well, significant challenges and perhaps weaknesses. But I know there are alternative interpretations that really challenge this whole narrative of decline.
Yes, and these counter-narratives are absolutely vital for getting a balanced picture. W.D. Rubenstein, for example, put forward a really interesting argument in the 1990s. He argued that Britain's economy was actually never primarily industrial or manufacturing based in the first place. He saw its core strength, its comparative advantage, as always being in commerce, finance, and services. Think banking, insurance, shipping.
So the City of London, essentially.
Yep, exactly. What others were calling industrial decline, Rubenstein viewed as more of an intelligent, rational transfer of resources and entrepreneurial energies away from manufacturing and into these other, more profitable business forms. He argued that the invisible earnings from these services and overseas investments more than offset any relative fall in manufacturing income. It wasn't decline, it was a strategic shift.
That's a really powerful reframing. Not a decline, but a clever adaptation into areas where Britain still led the world.
Precisely, in his view. And Martin Pugh made a similar point, arguing that Britain's manufacturing decline was only relative to the faster growth of others. It wasn't an absolute fall for a long time. Pugh highlighted an impressive range of new enterprises emerging in Britain during this period: motor cars, bicycles, telephones, soap, chemicals, plus the spread of retail chains we still know today, like Sainsbury's and Lipton's, even fish and chip shops.
By everyday innovations.
Yeah. And he stressed that exports in the traditional industries, coal, pig iron, steel, shipbuilding, textiles, actually continued to increase in absolute terms, reaching new peaks in the 1890s. It was Britain's share of the world total that fell as others caught up. Britain still built something like 90% of the world's ships in 1890 and was undeniably the world's financial center. The economy was still incredibly powerful.
So the overall global economic pie was just getting much bigger, and Britain still had a massive slice, even if its proportion shrunk a bit. And Theo Barker offered another interesting take, didn't he? Challenging some of the criticisms.
Yes, Theo Barker directly challenged many of the traditional arguments about failure. He suggested that Britain's apparent delay in adopting some new industries might actually have been beneficial. He argued it allowed Britain to learn from the trial and error efforts abroad and adopt more efficient techniques before 1914, avoiding costly mistakes.
Yeah.
Interesting perspective. He also contended that the old industries were actually willing to change, maybe more than critics admit, and that science education wasn't as inadequate as sometimes portrayed. For Barker, things were broadly okay, adapting reasonably well. Until World War I. Barker posits the Great War as the major disruptor, the event that massively accelerated trends that British manufacturers might otherwise have coped with or adapted to more gradually.
So World War I was the real culprit that pushed things over the edge, in his view.
Barker certainly leans heavily that way. Other historians, like Black and McRail, while they absolutely agree the war massively exacerbated existing weaknesses, they don't place all the blame there. They concede that even in 1914, on the eve of the war, the British economy was still far stronger in absolute terms than it had been 50 years earlier. It remained one of the world's top 3 economies, and in some areas, like finance and shipping, still the absolute leader.
A complex picture indeed. Still a giant, but maybe a giant facing new, tougher rivals and some internal challenges. Okay, that's a great look at industry. Let's switch gears now to agriculture, because it had its own quite distinct journey through a golden age and then into serious challenges. What exactly do we mean by high farming?
Right, high farming. It's a term that comes from a pamphlet by James Caird back in 1849. This was just after the Corn Laws were abolished in 1846. Those laws had protected British grain farmers from foreign competition. With them gone, Caird urged farmers to respond by essentially farming more intensively, using all the latest techniques to boost yields per acre, lower costs, and basically cope with the prospect of foreign competition.
So farming smarter, basically.
Exactly. And the period from about 1853 onwards is often called the real golden age of British agriculture. It brought remarkable prosperity. Farmers' incomes often doubled, and importantly, even agricultural laborers benefited to some extent, with better wages, slightly better housing, and more varied food available.
So how did this high farming actually lead to such prosperity? What specific techniques were involved?
It was a combination of things. There was much wider use of clay piping for land drainage, which improved soil quality. More farmers adopted mixed farming, combining arable crops with raising livestock, which spread risk and improved soil fertility. There was a big increase in the use of artificial fertilizers, things like nitrate of soda, Peruvian guano, German potash, boosting crop yields.
Guano. Bird dropping.
What? Imported bird droppings from Peru. Highly effective fertilizer back then. Farmers also focused on improving pedigree cattle breeds like Herefords and Aberdeen Angus. And new machines like the horse-drawn reaper became common, speeding up harvests. Steam threshing machines and even steam plows existed, though maybe less widespread than the reaper.
And was there scientific support for this?
Research, absolutely. The Royal Agricultural Society of England, founded back in 1838, was active, publishing a journal, organizing agricultural shows to spread best practice. And critically, the Rothamsted Experimental Station, set up in 1842, was doing vital scientific research into soils and fertilizers, providing a real evidence base for these new techniques.
And just like with industry, the growing population must have been a huge boon for farmers, providing consistent demand.
Yes, a massive factor. Britain's rapidly increasing population ensured a constantly growing demand for food, which kept prices and profits generally high. Interestingly, while wheat prices remained fairly steady due to some existing imports, prices for meat, butter, cheese, and wool rose significantly, sometimes by nearly 50% during this period.
And less foreign competition for those products initially.
Very little initially. That's key. Unlike wheat, where some Russian and American grain was already coming in for things like meat and dairy, the lack of fast shipping and especially refrigeration meant very little competition from overseas producers. British farmers had the home market largely to themselves for these higher value goods.
And railways, which we talked about for industry, they must have also revolutionized agriculture.
Hugely transformative for agriculture, too. Railways meant farmers could transport livestock quickly and cheaply to markets. And crucially, perishable goods like fresh meat, milk, fruit, vegetables, market garden produce could now be sent over long distances to the rapidly growing cities.
So farmers further away weren't isolated anymore.
Exactly. Suddenly, farmers far from urban centers had access to vast new consumer bases. Milk from Norfolk could reach London fresh. Meat from Aberdeenshire could supply industrial Lancashire. It opened up huge opportunities. Plus, the weather generally cooperated. A consistent run of good summers and decent harvests between 1850 and 1873 really helped.
So a true golden age. What brought it to such a sudden and quite dramatic end after 1873, especially for those growing wheat and cereals?
The change was quite abrupt, particularly for arable farmers. Prices plunged, profits evaporated, harvests shrunk, and significant amounts of land actually went out of cultivation altogether. Now, livestock and dairy farming were less affected initially. Their boom lasted into the 1880s, but eventually they felt the pressure too.
What were the main reasons for this sudden downturn?
Two main culprits stand out. First, really bad weather. Starting with a wet summer in 1873, Britain then suffered about 12 years of generally above-average rainfall and below-average temperatures. This absolutely ruined cereal crops year after year. It also led to widespread diseases among livestock: pneumonia, foot and mouth disease, liver rot in sheep, swine fever. A terrible blow from nature.
A perfect storm of bad weather.
It was. But the most significant cause, the one that had the longest lasting impact, was the flood of cheap foreign food imports. We mentioned railways earlier. Well, Transcontinental railways being built across North America opened up the vast, fertile prairies for wheat cultivation on an enormous scale.
Right. Cheap land, big farms.
Exactly. And simultaneously, large merchant steamships were becoming much more efficient. They could transport wheat from America, Canada, India, Australia, Argentina swiftly and incredibly cheaply to Britain. The cost of shipping a ton of wheat from Chicago to Liverpool, for example, fell by more than half between the late 1860s and the early 1880s.
That's a massive drop.
It meant foreign wheat could massively undercut British farmers' prices. British wheat prices fell by about half, hitting record lows, and wheat and flour imports just exploded, increasing about tenfold from the 1840s average to the 1900s average.
So the full effects of repealing the Corn Laws back in 1846, which high farming had maybe masked for a while, really hit home now.
Precisely. The combination of that surge in cheap imports, coinciding with those terrible domestic harvests due to the bad weather, created a devastating situation for British cereal farmers. And despite pressure from the agricultural lobby, Disraeli's conservative government refused to reintroduce tariffs to protect them. They stuck to free trade, even for food.
And then came refrigerated ships, which must have impacted the livestock farmers who had been doing okay.
That really sealed the deal for wider agricultural depression. In the 1880s, the development of effective refrigeration technology for ships meant frozen mutton could come from Australia and New Zealand and chilled beef from Argentina. Suddenly, even British meat producers faced intense overseas competition. It's even noted, somewhat amusingly, that this period saw the establishment of what became the traditional English breakfast, featuring Danish bacon and eggs. Imports became commonplace.
So what were the major results of this agricultural depression? How did farming adapt, or did it just collapse?
Well, there were significant consequences. Economically, many farmers, especially those relying heavily on wheat, went bankrupt. Tenant farmers fell behind on rent, forcing landowners to reduce rent significantly. Cereal-producing land shrank dramatically from about 9.6 million acres in 1872 down to 6.5 million by 1913.
A huge shift away from growing grain.
A massive shift. Politically, this financial hardship among the traditional landowning class contributed significantly to the decline in their dominance in Parliament. The House of Commons gradually saw more middle-class members, businessmen, industrialists, lawyers, and eventually even some working-class representatives. It was a key part of dismantling the old political order, driven by economic change.
So adaptation was absolutely key to survival for those who stayed in farming.
It really was. Farmers were forced to change or go under. The big adaptation was the shift away from arable land, growing crops, and towards pasture for animals. Pasture land increased by over 4 million acres between 1872 and 1913. Farmers focused much more on livestock, dairy farming, poultry, orchards, and market gardening, growing fruit, vegetables, flowers, bulbs, things that faced less direct competition or where freshness mattered.
And why was that shift generally successful?
Several reasons. Prices for animal feed actually fell, making livestock cheaper to raise. British meat, being fresh, was often seen as higher quality than the frozen imports, commanding a better price. And crucially, the demand for fresh milk in the growing industrial towns was enormous and couldn't easily be met by imports, so specializing in those areas worked.
But this must have had social effects, too. All that land shifting from crops to pasture probably meant fewer workers needed.
A huge social effect, yes. The shift away from labor-intensive arable farming displaced vast numbers of agricultural laborers. The workforce plummeted from over 2 million in 1851 down to just over 600,000 by 1901.
Well, where did they all go?
Many migrated to the cities looking for work in industry or services. Others emigrated abroad to Canada, Australia, the USA. It was a massive internal and external migration. However, there was an upside for the working class who had jobs. The continued free trade policy, especially the refusal to put tariffs on food, meant food became much cheaper.
The silver lining.
Exactly. Workers with jobs enjoyed a significantly higher standard of living as food costs fell. They had more disposable income to spend on other goods, things previously unaffordable. And even on leisure activities, this cheaper food and extra cash is seen as a factor in the popularization of things like professional football.
Fascinating connection. And did agriculture eventually see any kind of recovery after, say, 1900?
It did see a stabilization and slight recovery. By 1914, total agricultural output had actually increased by about 5% compared to 1900, and prices, even for wheat, were starting to rise again. This wasn't really a return to the old golden age, though. It was more a sign that the intense foreign competition had forced farmers to become much more efficient, to adapt their practices, or simply go out of business. The Eversley Commission in the 1890s had encouraged this diversification. The government also helped a bit, forbidding live cattle imports in 1892, mainly for disease control, but it did remove some competition too. So the farmers who survived into the early 20th century were the ones who had successfully learned how to operate, how to compete within this new, challenging global market.
So we've traced this incredible journey. Britain goes from being the completely undisputed workshop of the world, riding this wave of industrial and agricultural prosperity, to then navigating these really profound periods of challenge and change in both sectors. What really emerges is this complex story. Yes, elements of decline in relative global terms, but also huge amounts of adaptation, strategic shifts, resilience, and even those unexpected societal benefits, like cheaper food-boosting living standards for many.
Indeed. And it leaves us with a really interesting question to ponder, especially thinking about today's world. When you look at the dynamic changes Britain experienced in the late 19th century, particularly those intense debates around its decline versus its adaptation, what critical lesson does that period offer us now about how major economies respond to global competition, the pressures of innovation, and maybe the downsides of being the first mover? How do societies balance those established strengths with the absolute necessity of evolving when faced with new challenges? Something to think about.